All right, well, welcome back to the book of Esther. We are at lesson 4, and in this lesson, we meet a couple of more characters. We meet Esther's uncle Mordecai, who is a faithful Jew and has taken Esther in. And then we're also going to meet Haman, who is the bad guy in the story. And we'll spend some time comparing and contrasting those two and what we can learn about what Mordecai's righteousness looks like compared to Haman's unrighteousness and unfaithfulness. Got a little bit of a deep history with Haman as well that we'll take a look at. And then our memory verse will kind of tie all that together and point us back to Jesus and how all these things teach us more about Christ. So as we dive in, we'll take a look first at Mordecai, and the story teaches us first about Mordecai. Of course, we learn about him that he is Esther's uncle, but we learn more about him as he discovers this plot to overthrow the king, which, as you might imagine, happens quite often because the king holds the power. And so it was a pretty constant threat for kings to have these plots against their lives. And Mordecai righteously discovers this plot and reveals it. And if you remember last lesson, we talked about God's favor being shown to Esther and how the name of God is actually not mentioned in the book of Esther, but we start to see his fingerprint showing up all over the story. And we start to see him orchestrating his plan by making Esther the queen and showing her favor. Well, that's taken a step further here because Mordecai just happens to be in the right place at the right time to hear this plot to overthrow the king. And who do you think he goes and tells about it? Well, of course, he goes and tells Esther, and Esther is able to communicate that and save the king's life. And so we see that God is at work, not only through Esther, but also through Mordecai. And all these things are not happening by coincidence. And we can kind of throw that back to the last lesson and talk a little bit more about how God is sovereign over these circumstances and he's in control. So talk about that a little bit with your group. But then also, as you think through these things with your group and you look at Mordecai and what he does, you can also put yourself a little bit in his shoes, and he discovers this plot and he does this king a huge favor, and it kind of looks like it's forgotten. If you're Mordecai after this discovery and this righteous deed that he does to save the king, you might expect something more to happen. You may expect some kind of parade in your honor or to be given, some job within the king's kingdom. And none of that really happens. It just kind of looks like life goes on, and it looks like it's just not a big deal in Mordecai's life. But we're given this little tidbit that it's recorded in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings. And that's actually going to come about later in the story. But for Mordecai's part, and for our part, really, when we do these righteous deeds, when we do things that are honoring to God and we show faithfulness, sometimes it's easy to get discouraged because it looks like those things are forgotten. And so talk about that with your group, about how when we do these things, it's not for the immediate reward. We'll look at Haman in a minute, and everything he did was for the immediate reward. But Mordecai just does the right thing because it's the right thing. And that's what God has called us to do, is just to do the right thing. More often than not, we may not see an immediate reward for that, but we know that we are seeking that greater reward where we're here at the end. Well done, that good and faithful servant. So Mordecai is a good example of that. Contrasting Mordecai is Haman, and Haman is every bit Mordecai's opposite. Whereas Mordecai stops a plot, Haman hatches a plot, and his plot is, of course, to kill the Jews. Mordecai is a faithful Jew. And this is where you can spend some time going into Haman's history a little bit. Haman is a descendant from one of the Jewish nation's oldest enemies. And this can get a little bit tricky, but it doesn't have to. Just if you go with your group and read through the passage in Deuteronomy that's mentioned in the outline, Deuteronomy chapter 25, and just kind of walk through this story. You may want to brush up on the story if you haven't read it in a while yourself. But Haman is called an Agagite. and the Agag was the king of the Amalekites, and then they are mentioned in Deuteronomy after the Jewish people leave Egypt. The Amalekites are the ones that attack them, and they kill the weak among them. And so once Israel is established, King Saul is told to go and wipe the Amalekites out. And of course, Saul, this is probably one of his most famous moments of disobedience. He refuses to kill the king. He allows Agag to live. And now it's coming back to haunt the Jewish people because this descendant of the Amalekites, Haman, is plotting to kill the Jewish people. And so we see the remnants of Saul's unfaithfulness years and years and years later, and we're kind of haunted by this. Will God remain faithful? Will God deliver his people when he gave them a chance years and years and years ago and they refused to be obedient? And so as Haman pops up, just as Mordecai, it was no coincidence that he is put in this place, and Esther, it's no coincidence that she's put in this place. Haman has a long history as well. And so this is not just some random enemy of the Jews. This is an old enemy. This is an ancient enemy that is coming up to fight against God's people. And so whereas Mordecai is this picture of a faithful Jew, Haman is this picture of this ancient enemy that is rearing his ugly head again. And will God deliver from this enemy once more, or will the people of God fail? And so that's the situation that we find ourselves in. So Mordecai, of course, worships God. He is a faithful Jew. He worships the God of Israel, and Haman wants Mordecai to worship him. We find this in the story that Mordecai refuses to bow down, and Haman is really bothered by that. Mordecai's good deed is hidden, and Haman is trying to keep his plot hidden and goes to great lengths to do that. So what do Haman and Mordecai teach us? Well, Mordecai teaches us what it looks like to be righteous. He is seeking the good of others. He is saving life. He is seeking others' welfare. He's doing it with no thought of his own in mind, at least none that we can discern. He is just doing it because it is the right thing to do. Whereas Haman, on the other hand, is seeking to kill and destroy. He's seeking to have himself worshipped. He's seeking to have himself exalted. He wants all the praise and recognition and reward poured on him. And that's only going to continue more and more. We're going to look at Haman more and more. But so we tie all that into Jesus, and there's this wonderful connecting point that the memory verse will really help us with in John 10:10 when we talk about the parable of the Good Shepherd. And Jesus says he is the good shepherd, and he contrasts that with the thieves. And just spend some time with your group talking about the difference between the good shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep and the thieves who really are trying to get something out of the sheep and trying to fatten themselves off the sheep. And that parable, the shepherd has a long history as well. But just kind of bring that out about how where Mordecai was seeking the welfare of the king and Haman was seeking his own welfare. Well, whose welfare is Jesus seeking? He's seeking ours. And we know that because he laid down his life for us. So connect it back to Jesus and remember that he is the ultimate picture of the faithful Israelite who did everything in obedience to God for the joy set before him. He endured the cross.